Good afternoon, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting sundial. Getting back to this one, I'm going to continue with the cobble coloration today. I got two different tones of blue mixed up, very light, bright blue, and I'm going to start in on that now.
Yet it is inherited in some way.
There we go.
And I think that's happening by morphic resonance, you see. I think it's a kind of resonance as you learn something. And when you learn something lots of people have learned before, like swimming or riding a bicycle, I think this is facilitated by morphic resonance. So when it comes to the cultural forms we adopt, then every cultural form, every behavior pattern that's been shared by lots of people would have a kind of morphic field. And what we tune into, if we take up a hobby, say like building model aeroplanes, then you'd sort of tune into the field of model aeroplane builders, and you learn how to sort of glue the balsa wood together and stuff more quickly than you might otherwise have done.
I think you mentioned Darwin even touching on something that was like morphic field-like phenomena in The Descent of Man, is that right? Where he's talking, I think, about like dogs inheriting the traits of their parents. That's outside of just, pure, he didn't have DNA at the time, but this pure kind of material model.
Well, Darwin's very interested in the inheritance of acquired characters. You know that the offspring could inherit adaptations or behavior from their parents, sometimes called Lamarckian inheritance. Well, Darwin was a Lamarckian. Neo-Darwinians, like Richard Dawkins, reject that aspect of Darwin, but since the beginning of the 21st century, Lamarckian inheritance is really back in fashion, having been rebranded epigenetic inheritance.
Yes.
So I think that a lot of epigenetic inheritance is in fact a result of morphic resonance. It's usually assumed it's all a matter of molecular changes in methylation of the DNA, or changes in histones, or small RNA molecules or something. So the fact that people can propose some molecular basis has given people permission to accept that it's real. But it's not proven that that's how it actually works in most cases. The question is open. So I think that the case that Darwin reported in a paper in Nature was a dog that belonged to someone he knew that got very frightened whenever it went past a butcher's shop. And it turned out its father had done the same. And so Darwin speculated that this behavior may have been because the grandfather had been maltreated by a butcher, and the fear of butchers had been inherited by these dogs. But you see, he couldn't, that was just telling the story. I mean, Darwin, like me, was interested in what people actually observed. He didn't just say this is a mere anecdote, it has no relevance or is of no interest. He thought this was a data point that was worth taking seriously. And now, recent research in epigenetics with mouse behavior has shown something very similar in laboratory experiments. I don't know if you've followed the mouse fear experiments.
No.
Well, when they were published in Nature, the title was Inheriting the Fear of Fathers. And in these experiments, the researchers, this was at some university in the US, I've forgotten which one, I mean, this is quite well-known mainstream research. They took male mice and they made them frightened of a smell called acetophenone. It smells a bit like cherries, it's a synthetic chemical. So they exposed the mice to this smell, and they gave them a mild electric shock through their pores. And this is kind of classical aversive conditioning type thing. So after a few times, when the mice smelt acetophenone, they were petrified, and when mice are frightened, they simply freeze. You can measure the freeze response. So they trained these mice to be terrified of acetophenone. Then they bred from them with mothers who'd never been exposed to acetophenone, and then tested the children and the grandchildren, and they were terrified of acetophenone. In a single generation, a fear of a particular chemical had been inherited by these mice, in a way that couldn't possibly be explained by cultural transmission, was a form of epigenetic or inheritance or perhaps morphic resonance.
That's fascinating. It's so funny. It is very in vogue to say, I'm healing my ancestral trauma, and everybody is talking about DNA methylation and epigenetics.
Yeah.
And you were talking about morphic resonance and morphic fields far before. Like organ donor recipients inheriting some of the attributes of the donor. Like in certain cases, you suddenly know French, or you know how to drum, or like you pick up the skill from the person that's giving you the organ.
Yes, I mean the best documented are the heart transplant cases. Well, you see, what people usually say there is, well, the memories must have been stored inside the heart, in the cells, a cellular memory or something that's got transferred. What I think, because I don't think memories are stored in cells, I think they work by morphic resonance. When someone's had a heart transplant, that heart continues to resonate with the donor, and including characteristics of the donor's behaviour and appetites and likes and dislikes and so on. And these are fascinating cases where the recipient takes up characteristics of the donor and they, without knowing anything about the donor. And so there's a transfer of memory with the heart, but I don't think it's in the heart. There's a somewhat similar experiment of Michael Levin's with flatworms and learning. I don't know if you're familiar with that experiment.
No, what's the experiment?
Well, I'm a big fan of Michael Levin, and I think he's the most inventive biologist working at present.
Yeah.
And he did these experiments with flatworms, which are small worms which are flat. That's why they're called flatworms. They have a head with sort of a region with little eyes and a tail region. And they don't have much of a brain, but they do have a sort of cerebral ganglion in the head. He trained these flatworms to respond to particular stimuli that he could measure their response. They learned the effect. Then he cut their heads off, and flatworms regenerate very easily. And the flatworms regenerated new heads. And when he tested the flatworms, they could still remember what they'd learned before.
Wild.
So, you see, one possibility would be that the memory had been stored all over the body and in the cells of the flatworm. That would be the conventional explanation of Levin's experiments. My explanation would be that it was morphic resonance with the previous form of the intact form of the flatworm. They were resonating with themselves in the past. Now, the experiments don't enable you to decide between those two interpretations, and most people would go with the cellular memory interpretation. The point is about Michael Levin, he's really pushing the boundaries of biology, but he remains fairly non-committal about exactly how this is happening. I know he's very intrigued by the possibility of there being more to biology than just physics and chemistry and standard science, but he walks a tightrope between pushing the boundary and going too far. If he went too far, I mean, most people would say, I go too far. The result of going too far is then you're no longer employed as a prestigious professor in a top university and that sort of thing. It does affect your career.
That's my sense of him, is I look at the books he reads, and it seems like he's pretty sympathetic to a lot of this sort of consciousness being a proto-layer in biology and parapsychology, and I think he spent time in Tibet with some monks out there. And I get this sense that he's far more heretical in his private beliefs than what meets the eye. He has to kind of walk the tightrope. But are you familiar with a scientist at actually University of Surrey named John Joe McFadden?
Yes, I know him, yes.
Because that would be one example of kind of a non-local theory of consciousness, but in this case it would be electromagnetism would be the kind of conduit for information transfer. But what would you say about that theory?
Well, that's relevant to what we were talking about earlier in the consciousness of the sun.
Yeah.
Because John Joe McFadden not only argues that the conscious activity of our brains is linked to the electromagnetic field, he argues that it is the electromagnetic field. The electromagnetic field, seen from within, as it were, is conscious. And on the McFadden principle, then you could say that the electromagnetic field of the sun is the consciousness of the sun when it's experienced from within. I myself don't think that electromagnetic fields are themselves conscious. I think they interface with consciousness. I think they're the bridge or the interface between morphic fields, which are the fields of the mind, as it were, that interact with the electromagnetic fields. So when it comes to these psychic phenomena, for example, the sense of being stared at, which we just talked about, I'm just releasing an app at the moment which works on cell phones, where you can train yourself to get better at it. And now I know it's possible to train yourself because in the martial arts, there are various martial arts programs where they train people to know when they're being looked at from behind, because it's useful for self-defense. You know, if someone's sneaking up from behind planning to attack you, if you can feel them coming, you'll survive, and if you can't, you won't. So it's worth training. And so they already have training programs, but this app works on cell phones, so anyone can try training themselves to get better at it.
How does it work?
How does the app work?
Yeah.
It's just a very simple test. So if I were doing it with you, we'd both have our cell phones tuned in. There'd be a QR code on mine, you'd take the thing on yours, so they'd linked up together. Then mine, in a random sequence, you'd sit with your back to me, with a blindfold on, probably. It's best with a blindfold. And mine would then say, you know, first trial, look. And so I'd stare at the back of your neck. You'd hear a noise that indicates the beginning of a trial. And within 5 or 10 seconds, you have to say whether you're being looked at or not, yes or no. You can just say yes or no, recognise his voice. So you can have the mobile phone there. So you hear the sound, ooh, the trial begins, say yes, and it records that guess, and then next trial begins. You know, might be no, I might be told not to look at you, I look at the floor and think of something else, or close my eyes. So that's my basic test for the sense of being stared at, and when you do that test, most people score above chance, but not very much above chance, about 55% compared with 50%. But some people can get 60 or 70% or 80%. So in this app, what I want is for people to try it out, doing it with feedback, you know, if you're told whether you're right or wrong every time. Or even if you just have an informal session where we just had nothing else to do and you sat with your back to me and I said, I'm going to look at you now, Jesse. I'm looking at you. And I'd say, I've stopped looking at you, no, I'm not looking at you. And you would like biofeedback. You don't need to understand it consciously. Biofeedback, where people can learn to regulate their heartbeat and so on, and blood pressure. It's not conscious learning, do this, do that, in a logical sequence. It's learning unconscious cues implicitly. And so I think that with this system, which I'm just launching now, this app, and in fact, anyone who's listening to us who wants to try it can go to my website.
I'll put the link in the description, yes.
Because when people have found out, you know, whether they can improve, what I want to find out is, first of all, what works for people. I don't know what works. That's why it's a citizen science project. And then, even better, if someone can find out what works for them and can develop a system where they can train other people to get better at it. It's basically, it's a matter of tuning into your feelings as opposed to rational thoughts. And the minute you start thinking about it, well, it was meant to be random, it was not looking last time, so it should be looking this time. You know, as soon as you start that kind of thinking, it's gone. But so it's a matter of tuning into your thoughts. And then, because this is system science and people are doing it at home, then they can find out, does meditation affect it? Are you more sensitive if you've been meditating? Does it work better under cannabis or MDMA? You know, you couldn't do this in a university with, you know, imagine ethics approval committees, years of deliberation and stuff. But the fact is you don't need all that. People can just do it. It doesn't cost anything. And people can do it at home. And the system then gives feedback on how your score's getting on, and you can see if you're improving or not. And I'm asking people if they can routinely get up to about 75%, which is very significantly above chance, to write to me, email me and let me know. So I'm hoping that I'll get feedback on this experiment from people who do experiments with their family and friends.
What's it called?
Staring app.
Staring app. Download it now. What about blind sight? So this phenomena where somebody's visually impaired in the traditional sense, and then they can sort of, in certain cases, actually literally artificially visually impair themselves, like be blindfolded, but they can somehow know when somebody's in front of them or navigate some, treacherous terrain or whatever. And there's I think a site in Texas that teaches people to kind of develop these senses. How does that comport with your vision model?
I don't know. There's two different things. Blind sight is where monkeys or things that have had, or people that have had damage to the visual cortex of the brain can behave as if they're recognizing objects, but they're not consciously aware of it. That's how it's usually used in science. But there's this other thing which is often called extraocular vision, beyond seeing without the eyes, where blindfolded people can tell what things are, as it were, see things that they couldn't possibly be seeing with their eyes. And there are methods that train children to do this. It's most successful with 7 or 8-year-old children, who are the best subjects for this kind of thing. There's the whole group's training children to do this in Mexico and in Spain, and I don't know whether there's much happening in the US or Britain, but I know about it from Spain. So I have a colleague in Spain who's working on this.
It's definitely more evidence for morphic field. And all the brain injury stuff too, where it's like you have like 44% of your brain because of some bizarre injury, and then it sort of reassembles so that you're like totally functional and you don't even realize it for like a long time. Like there are all these examples of that. And so it's semantic information does not seem like it's locally stored.
No. I mean, there's lots of suggestive information, suggestive evidence for all this. Extraocular vision, though, is a great puzzle. I don't pretend to understand how it works. I mean, I'm interested in it because, in a sense, the scopaesthesia, the sense of being stared at, is a related thing, because you can detect when someone's looking at you from behind, and you're not doing it with your eyes. So they're vaguely related, and I wish I knew how. So, I mean, these are things I spent a lot of time thinking about. And I talk to colleagues in parapsychology, in physics, in other subjects, and nobody understands these things. We really are on the frontiers of the unknown with all these phenomena.
Let's talk about, it's a good segue because you brought up Thomas Kuhn. So he wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, but he was friends with actually John Mack, who was the head of the Harvard Psychiatry Department, and who spent the end of his life studying this sort of alien abduction phenomena. You wrote a book, I didn't even realize this until recently, called The Physics of Angels, with, was it Matthew Fox was your co-author? And I find that to be a very interesting frame when studying kind of UFOs and aliens. There's a religious studies professor named Diana Pasulka, and there's a guy named Jacques Vallée, this French ufologist, both of whom believe that aliens are sort of the contemporary version of angels and demons, which if you apply a sort of Lindy, like what's the most tried and true human heuristic to this stuff, it's probably that. So what motivated you to write that book, and what are the physics of angels?
Well, what really motivated me was the idea that there are forms of intelligence or consciousness above the human level, beyond the human level, like the sun and the stars. I mean, I've been interested in the idea of conscious sun and stars for a long time. I mean, my paper on the subject was much more recent, and because the climate has changed within science, panpsychism is now a live topic of debate, and I wouldn't have stood a chance of publishing a paper in a scientific journal on this, 20 years ago. When I was thinking about, the idea that the stars are conscious and the planets may be conscious too, I became aware that in the Middle Ages, in standard thought in Christian universities, influenced by St. Thomas Aquinas and all the great theologians and philosophers of the time, it was taken for granted that the universe was alive. It was taken for granted that nature, animals and plants were beings with souls, that they were animate. That's why we call animals animals, because anima means soul in Latin. And you know, this was before the 17th century, the machine theory of nature. Medieval Christianity was essentially animistic and treated all of nature as alive. And they thought that each star or planet had its own intelligence. It was not only alive but intelligent, and its guiding angel. So there was a whole category of angels which were organizing or being the intelligences of the heavenly bodies. There were other angels that were, as it were, the intelligences guiding or organizing process on Earth. And there were others that were kind of cosmic archetypes of consciousness. So there were 9 levels of angels based in 3 areas.
Is this in Aquinas'?
This is in Aquinas. It's in Dionysius the Areopagite, who was a 6th century Syrian monk, who had huge influence on Christian theology.
As did Iamblichus, also Syrian
Neoplatonist,
who had his own angel hierarchy.
Well, Dionysius the Areopagite was a Neoplatonist. And so because I was interested in the idea of intelligences beyond the human level, there was no need to reinvent this, because that's what our ancestors, you know, because Jewish philosophers and Islamic philosophers all have angels, and the Bible is full of angels, both the Old and the New Testament. So in the whole Judeo-Christian and Islamic tradition, you have these beings at different levels. And Matthew Fox is a friend of mine, he's a theologian. And so when I was discussing it with him, I said, well, you know, what about these medieval theories of angels? They've already got the idea of lots of intelligences beyond the human level. Is it relevant today? Of Dionysius the Areopagite, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Hildegard of Bingen, the visionary medieval abbess in Germany, who was a mystic and a poet. And we chose the most interesting passages in their books about angels, the most relevant ones. And then we discussed each short passage as a dialogue. And that's what the book is really. And it's looking at the traditional ideas of angels in the Western tradition and how these ideas might be relevant today as we think about consciousness.
All right, still have a few minutes left, but that's a pretty even dispersal of those 2 colors. So I'm going to leave it at that for the moment, and then go back with the same colors. As you may have noticed, I've been developing the upper tree leaf light things with other colors as well. Made them a little more dense and added a turquoise layer. So I'm going to take this sort of bright teal and this medium blue and bring that color up into...
You see these specific attributes that they tie to specific angel categories.
Yes.
And some do actually.
So that's it for the moment. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, Mexico, working on oil painting sundial. Thank you for watching, and have a good day, Earth.
You know, they wouldn't use the word electromagnetic.